The man who fought 3 armies, 3 wars, 1 enemy. Larry Thorne's impossible life. October 18th, 1965, 25 miles southwest of Da Nang, South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese Air Force CH-34 helicopter shuddered as it climbed through thick clouds, the twin Pratt & Whitney radial engines straining against mountain winds and zero visibility. At the controls, First Lieutenant Fan Long fought to maintain altitude, his instruments barely readable through the rain streaming across the windscreen. In the cargo bay, Major Larry Allen Thorne sat strapped into the canvas seat, his Car-15 rifle secured between his knees, watching the altimeter needle climb past 6,000 feet. The 46-year-old Special Forces officer had been on hundreds of helicopter missions, in weather far worse than this, in terrain more hostile. This was supposed to be routine, a command and control flight, monitoring the insertion of a 6-man reconnaissance team into Laos as part of Operation Shining Brass, the first official MACV-SOG cross-border mission. Through the open cargo door, Thorne could see nothing but grey clouds and occasional glimpses of jungle-covered mountains. The weather had deteriorated rapidly after the reconnaissance team's insertion, forcing the command helicopter to orbit at higher altitude while waiting for the team's initial radio check. Lieutenant Fan Long's voice crackled over the intercom speaking Vietnamese, then switching to broken English for Thorne's benefit. "Weather very bad, we go back Cam Duke." Thorne nodded, standard procedure. The recon team was on the ground and had reported in. The command helicopter's job was done, time to return to base before the weather got worse. What happened in the next 60 seconds would remain a mystery for 34 years. The helicopter entered a cloud bank, visibility dropped to 0 and then nothing. No mayday call, no distress signal, no emergency beacon. The CH-34 simply vanished, carrying with it one of the most extraordinary warriors of the 20th century. What the search and rescue crews who combed the mountains for the next 3 days didn't know, what MACV headquarters in Saigon couldn't have imagined, what even Thorne's fellow Green Berets only partially understood, was that the man they were looking for had already died twice before. Once in Finland in 1944, reported killed in action against the Soviet Union. Once in Germany in 1945, presumed executed by Soviet occupation forces. And here, in the mountains of Vietnam in 1965, he had finally run out of resurrections. The numbers tell a story that defies belief. 3 armies, 3 wars, 3 identities. 1 enemy, always the same enemy, pursued across 3 decades and 3 continents. Lauri Törni in Finland, Larry Lane in Germany, Larry Allen Thorne in America. Different names, different uniforms, different languages. But always the same man. Always the same mission. Kill communists until they killed him. The decorations told their own story. The Mannerheim Cross, Finland's highest military honour, equivalent to the Medal of Honour, awarded to only 187 men in Finnish history. The Iron Cross First and Second Class from Nazi Germany. The Distinguished Flying Cross, Bronze Star, Legion of Merit, and 5 Purple Hearts from the United States. No man in modern military history had been so honoured by so many nations for killing the same enemy. But statistics don't explain how. How does a Finnish ski trooper become a Waffen-SS officer, become an American Special Forces legend? How does a man sentenced to death by Soviet military tribunals end up buried with full honours in Arlington National Cemetery? How does someone officially killed in action in 1944 command a cross-border operation in Vietnam 21 years later? This is the story of Larry Thorne, the Eternal Warrior. How a boy from a Finnish border town became the most decorated anti-communist fighter in history. How he escaped death so many times that his enemies believed he was immortal. And how in the end it wasn't enemy fire that killed him, but the same mountains and weather that had been his allies for 25 years. But before we start, subscribe to the Vietnam Tales YouTube channel for more war stories. Now let's begin. Lauri Törni was born May 28, 1919, in Viipuri, a city in southeastern Finland near the Russian border. His father, Jalmari, was a ship captain. His mother, Rosa, raised 4 children in a household where military service was considered the highest honour. Young Lauri grew up hearing stories of Finnish resistance against Russian expansion, tales that stretched back centuries of a small nation refusing to surrender to the giant to the east. In 1938, at age 19, Törni enlisted in the Finnish army. completing his mandatory service as a reserve second lieutenant. He returned to civilian life, working odd jobs, skiing in the winter, hunting in the forests, living the typical life of a young Finn in the late 30s. Then, on November 30th, 1939, everything changed. The Soviet Union, emboldened by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Nazi Germany, invaded Finland with overwhelming force. 26 Soviet divisions, over 450,000 men, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, crashed across the border. Stalin expected Finland to collapse within weeks, another small nation absorbed into the Soviet Empire. Finland mobilized 337,000 men, outnumbered 3-1, equipped with obsolete weapons, lacking tanks and aircraft. The Winter War had begun, and Second Lieutenant Lauri Törni reported to his unit in the Karelian Isthmus, ready to die for his homeland. What followed was one of the most extraordinary defensive campaigns in military history. The Finns, fighting on their own terrain in brutal winter conditions, inflicted catastrophic casualties on Soviet forces. Finnish ski troops, wearing white winter camouflage, would appear from the forest like ghosts, attack Soviet columns with devastating efficiency, and disappear back into the trees before the Soviets could respond. Törni commanded a ski patrol, 12 men moving through forests at night in temperatures reaching -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They travelled on skis carrying Finnish Suomi submachine guns, simple weapons but devastatingly effective at close range. The Soviets, struggling in deep snow, road-bound, visible in their dark uniforms against white terrain, were slaughtered. On January 17, 1940, Törni's patrol ambushed a Soviet supply column near Lake Ladoga. The Finns, positioned in the trees on both sides of the frozen road, waited until the column was completely committed. Trucks, horses, men, all struggling through the snow. Then Törni gave the signal. 12 Suomi submachine guns opened fire simultaneously. The 9mm rounds, fired at cyclic rates of 900 rounds per minute, created a wall of lead that destroyed the column in seconds. Drivers were killed at their wheels, horses screamed and fell, soldiers trying to deploy from trucks were cut down before touching the ground. The Finns held their fire after the initial burst, watching, waiting. Soviet soldiers, survivors from the first volley, tried to organize a defense. Törni's men picked them off with aimed shots, conserving ammunition. When silence returned, the patrol moved through the wreckage, gathering weapons, ammunition, and documents. 53 Soviet soldiers dead, 0 Finnish casualties. This pattern repeated throughout the Winter War. Small Finnish units, operating independently, destroyed Soviet forces that outnumbered them by factors of 10 or 20-1. The Soviets called it Motti tactics, a Finnish word meaning a measured amount of firewood, because the Finns would surround and isolate Soviet units, then chop them to pieces. Törni's reputation grew with each successful engagement. His superiors noted his coolness under fire, his ability to read terrain, his almost supernatural skill at anticipating enemy movements. He was wounded twice, once by shrapnel from a Soviet artillery shell, once by rifle fire that grazed his shoulder. Both times he refused evacuation, staying with his men. The Winter War ended March 13, 1940, with Finland forced to cede territory, but maintaining independence. The Soviets had won, technically, but at catastrophic cost. Over 126,000 Soviet soldiers killed, over 264,000 wounded. Finnish casualties were a fraction of that. The world took notice. The tiny nation had fought the Soviet bear to a standstill. Törni, now promoted to lieutenant, returned to a Finland that had survived but was profoundly changed. The peace was temporary, everyone knew it. The Soviets would return. And when they did, Finland would need every experienced officer it could find. In June 1941, Finland entered what they called the Continuation War, fighting alongside Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union. Törni, now a captain, commanded an infantry company in the 4th Independent Jäger Battalion. They operated deep behind Soviet lines, conducting reconnaissance, raids, and sabotage operations. By 1943, Törni's success had become such that the Finnish army created a unit specifically around him. Detachment Törni, officially part of the Finnish army, but operating with near-complete independence. The unit's mission was simple: penetrate Soviet rear areas, destroy supply lines, kill officers, create chaos. Detachment Törni consisted of approximately 60 men, handpicked by Törni himself, veterans, all of them, men who could ski 40 kilometers in a night, fight a battle at dawn, and ski 40 kilometers back before the Soviets could organize a response. They wore white camouflage in winter, forest camouflage in summer. They carried Finnish, German, and captured Soviet weapons, whatever worked best. They moved without resupply for weeks, living off the land and captured enemy rations. The Soviet Union placed a bounty on Törni's head, $650,000, an astronomical sum in 1943, for his capture or confirmed death. Soviet political officers distributed wanted posters showing Törni's face with Russian text promising the reward. Soviet commanders briefed their troops specifically about Detachment Törni, warning them to be on alert for the Finnish ghost soldiers. Törni's tactics were brutally effective. His detachment would study Soviet movements, identify key targets, plan meticulously, then strike with overwhelming violence. A Soviet regimental headquarters would be hit at midnight, command staff killed, communications destroyed, and the Finns would vanish before dawn. A supply depot would explode, trucks and ammunition going up in flames. An investigation would find ski tracks leading into the forest, and then nothing. On July 20th, 1943, Detachment Törni conducted their most famous operation. Soviet forces had captured a Finnish strongpoint on the Karelian front, a hilltop position that dominated the surrounding terrain. 2 Finnish attempts to retake the position had failed with heavy casualties. Törni volunteered to handle it. He took 30 men, moving through Soviet-controlled territory for 2 nights, approaching the captured position from the rear, from the direction the Soviets wouldn't expect. They observed the position for a full day, counting sentries, noting rotation schedules, identifying weak points. At 0300 hours, absolute darkness, Törni's men moved into position. They had left their skis behind, moving on foot in complete silence. Each man knew his target, his route, his fallback position. Törni would hit the command bunker with 10 men. The remaining 20 would create diversions, suppress counterattacks, and secure the withdrawal route. The assault began with knives. Finnish soldiers, trained in close combat since childhood, moved through the trench system like smoke. Sentries died silently, throats cut, bodies lowered quietly to the ground. The alarm wasn't raised for 5 minutes, and by then Törni's team had reached the command bunker. A single Finnish stick grenade thrown through the bunker entrance killed the Soviet company commander and his staff. Törni followed the explosion into the bunker, his Suomi submachine gun firing 3-round bursts at anything moving. The bunker was cleared in seconds. The diversionary teams opened fire on the flanks, convincing the Soviet defenders that they were under attack from multiple directions. Panic spread. Units fired at shadows. Officers tried to organize defenses against threats that weren't there. Meanwhile, Törni's assault team planted demolition charges on ammunition stockpiles and communication equipment. The withdrawal began 10 minutes after the initial assault. The Finns moved back the way they came, through the breach in Soviet lines, carrying their wounded, leaving nothing behind. The demolition charges detonated just as Soviet reinforcements began arriving, creating chaos and preventing pursuit. Detachment Törni returned to Finnish lines 36 hours later, having travelled over 80 kilometres through enemy territory. They had retaken the strongpoint, killed approximately 40 Soviet soldiers, destroyed significant supplies, and suffered 2 men wounded, none killed. Soviet commanders were furious. The mysterious Finnish unit had struck again, penetrating their lines, accomplishing a mission that battalion-sized attacks had failed to achieve, and vanishing like ghosts. The bounty on Törni's head was increased. Soviet security forces were ordered to capture him at all costs. But Törni had other concerns. By 1944 it was clear that Finland was losing the war. The massive Soviet offensives of summer 1944 pushed Finnish forces back despite heroic resistance. Finland sued for peace, signing an armistice in September 1944 that forced them to cede more territory and accept Soviet oversight. The armistice included a condition that enraged Törni. Finland was required to arrest and prosecute Finnish soldiers who had fought alongside German forces. Törni, who had received German training and worked closely with German units, was a prime target. He went underground, refusing to surrender to Finnish authorities who he knew would hand him over to the Soviets. In June 1945 he travelled to Germany, hoping to join resistance movements against Soviet occupation. But Germany was collapsing, the war ending, and Törni found himself trapped in a disintegrating nation. He surrendered to British forces, preferring Western Allied captivity to Soviet. But the British, following agreed-upon procedures, prepared to repatriate him to Finland, where Soviet authorities demanded his extradition for war crimes trial. Törni escaped from British custody in late 1945, one of the most audacious escapes of the immediate post-war period. He travelled through occupied Germany using forged papers, eventually reaching the British zone and then making his way back to Finland via Sweden. But returning to Finland was a mistake. The Finnish state police, Valpo, controlled by Soviet advisors, arrested him immediately in April 1946. He was tried for treason, the charge being that he had joined German forces against specific Finnish government orders. The trial was a formality. The verdict was predetermined. 6 years imprisonment. The sentence light only because his reputation in Finland made harsh punishment politically dangerous. Törni was sent to Turku prison, then transferred to the higher security Riihimäki state prison. He promptly escaped in June 1947, the details of the escape remaining mysterious to this day. Some accounts say he climbed over the walls, others claim he walked out hidden in a delivery truck. Regardless of method, he was free. He was recaptured within weeks, and this time the authorities took no chances. Maximum security, constant surveillance, isolation from other prisoners. Törni settled in to serve his sentence, knowing that after prison, the Soviets would certainly demand his extradition for war crimes trials in Moscow, which would mean execution. Then, in December 1948, something extraordinary happened. Finnish President Juho Paasikivi granted Törni a full pardon. The reasons remain debated. Some historians believe international pressure played a role, particularly from American intelligence services, who saw value in Törni's experience and fierce anti-communism. Others suggest that Finnish veterans groups lobbied intensely for his release. The truth probably involved both factors. Törni was released from prison, but he knew Finland wasn't safe. The Soviets still wanted him, and they had significant influence over the Finnish government. In 1949, he fled to Sweden, crossing the border at Tornio to Haparanda, where the local population, many of them ethnic Finns, helped him disappear. From Sweden, he made contact with a network of Finnish expatriates, and eventually connected with American intelligence services. The Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, predecessor to the CIA, had been tracking Törni since the war. A Finnish officer with his combat record, his fierce anti-communism and his willingness to fight the Soviets under any flag was exactly the kind of person American intelligence wanted. In 1950, with American assistance, Törni immigrated to the United States. He entered through Venezuela, a circuitous route designed to obscure his background and avoid Soviet attempts to have him extradited. He settled in New York initially, then Connecticut, working odd jobs, learning English, adjusting to a new life far from the snows of Finland. But Törni wasn't built for civilian life. He was a warrior, and in 1954 he found his calling again. The Lodge-Philbin Act, passed by Congress to allow Eastern European refugees to enlist in the US military, provided the opportunity. In December 1954, Lauri Törni walked into a US Army recruiting station in Connecticut and enlisted as a private. He anglicized his name to Larry Thorne, signed the enlistment papers, and shipped to basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey. At age 35, he was older than most recruits by 15 years. The drill sergeants, initially skeptical of the quiet Finn who spoke broken English, quickly realized they had someone extraordinary in their ranks. Thorne's performance in basic training was perfect. Every physical test, maximum score. Every written test, despite his limited English, passed easily. Marksmanship, expert qualification, hand-to-hand combat, he put instructors on the ground. Within weeks, the question wasn't whether Thorne would make it through basic training. The question was what the Army was going to do with someone who was clearly far beyond basic soldier skills. The answer came from Special Forces. The newly formed 10th Special Forces Group at Fort Bragg, North Carolina was recruiting. They wanted soldiers with unconventional warfare experience, foreign language skills, and most importantly, men who knew how to operate independently behind enemy lines. Thorne's background, once it was properly investigated, was exactly what they were looking for. There was a problem. Thorne's service in the Waffen-SS, even though he had fought as a Finnish officer in a Finnish unit under German command, made him technically ineligible for US military service. Nazi affiliations were automatic disqualification. But his service had been fighting the Soviets, not committing war crimes, and the United States, in the early years of the Cold War, was willing to overlook technical problems for soldiers of proven capability. William Wild Bill Donovan, the legendary founder of the OSS, personally intervened on Thorne's behalf. Donovan, who understood irregular warfare better than almost anyone in the US government, recognized Thorne's value. With Donovan's support and careful vetting by military intelligence, Thorne was cleared for Special Forces service. He reported to Fort Bragg in 1956, joining a cadre of instructors teaching the new generation of Green Berets. Thorne became an instructor in skiing, survival, mountaineering, and guerrilla tactics. Students quickly learned that the quiet Finnish NCO knew more about unconventional warfare than all the other instructors combined. Master Sergeant John Mullins, who attended the Special Warfare course in 1958, later described Thorne's teaching methods. He didn't lecture. He'd take us into the woods in the middle of winter, and we'd spend a week surviving. No tents, no sleeping bags, just what we carried. He'd show us how to move silently, how to navigate by stars, how to build shelters that were invisible from 10 feet away. Then he'd vanish and we wouldn't see him for 2 days. He'd be out there, watching us, evaluating us. If you screwed up, you'd know. He'd appear next to you, seemingly from nowhere, and just shake his head. That was worse than any ass-chewing. In 1957, having demonstrated exceptional ability and received his US citizenship, Thorne was selected for officer candidate school. He graduated as a second lieutenant in the Signal Corps, an unusual branch assignment that reflected his technical skills with communications equipment. But everyone knew he wouldn't stay in the Signal Corps. He was Special Forces, and in 1960 he received his regular Army commission as a captain and formal assignment to the 10th Special Forces Group. From 1958 to 62, Thorne served in West Germany at Bad Tölz, where the 10th Group maintained a forward operating base. This posting, deliberately chosen, allowed Thorne to operate near the Iron Curtain, close to the Soviet forces he had fought for 20 years. He trained German special operations units, ran exercises simulating penetration operations into East Germany and Czechoslovakia, and became known throughout NATO special operations circles as one of the most knowledgeable irregular warfare experts in the alliance. Then, in 1962, an incident occurred that would cement Thorne's legendary status within Special Forces. A US Air Force C-130 transport aircraft crashed on Mount Savalin in northern Iran, near the Soviet border. The plane was carrying classified surveillance equipment, and the crash site was at approximately 14,000 feet elevation in extremely rugged terrain, accessible only by technical mountaineering. 3 recovery missions had failed. Helicopter operations at that altitude in those conditions were nearly impossible. Ground approaches were blocked by terrain. The equipment couldn't be destroyed from the air without certainty, and leaving it for Soviet intelligence to potentially recover was unacceptable. Captain Larry Thorne volunteered to lead the recovery mission. He handpicked a 12-man team, all experienced mountaineers, and spent 2 weeks planning. The approach would be on foot, climbing routes that conventional wisdom said were impossible. The team would operate without resupply, carrying everything needed for 2 weeks in the mountains. The mission launched in April 1962. Thorne's team climbed to the crash site, secured the classified equipment, rigged it for helicopter extraction using techniques Thorne had developed specifically for high-altitude operations, and brought it down. The recovery was complete, the equipment secured, and 0 casualties suffered. A mission that 3 previous attempts had failed to accomplish, Thorne had achieved with planning, skill, and the same relentless determination that had characterized his entire military career. The Iran mission became legendary within Special Forces. Here was an officer who didn't just brief missions, he led them. Who didn't just teach mountaineering, he climbed mountains that defeated younger men, who had more combat experience than any 10 officers combined. Larry Thorne became the standard against which all Special Forces officers were measured. In November 1963, Thorne deployed to Vietnam, assigned to Detachment A-734, 5th Special Forces Group. His first tour was spent in the Mekong Delta, at a camp near Tin Bien in the Seven Mountains area. The camp, located near the Cambodian border, was positioned to interdict Viet Cong supply routes running from Cambodia into South Vietnam. Thorne applied the lessons he had learned in Finland and Germany: small unit operations, deep penetration patrols, ambushes on enemy supply lines. The tactics that had worked against the Soviets in the frozen forests of Karelia worked equally well against the Viet Cong in the jungles of the Delta. The camp at Tin Bien became a thorn in the Viet Cong side, pun intended in military reports. VC cadres operating in the Seven Mountains region found their supply lines constantly under attack. Convoys were ambushed. Supply caches were raided. Couriers were captured or killed. The Viet Cong tried repeatedly to overrun the camp, failing each time with heavy casualties. Thorne was wounded 3 times during this tour. The first wound, shrapnel from a VC mortar, was minor enough that he refused evacuation. The second, bullets grazing his arm during an ambush, also didn't stop him. The third, more serious, a bullet through his thigh during a night attack on the camp, finally forced him to accept medical treatment. He was evacuated to a rear area hospital, where doctors told him he was going home. Thorne refused. He convinced the medical board that he was fit for duty, leveraged every connection he had, and got himself reassigned. Not to a rear area position, not to a training command, but back to combat. In February 1965, he reported to MACV-SOG, Military Assistance Command Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, the most classified unit in the war. MACV-SOG was conducting operations that officially didn't exist: cross-border reconnaissance into Laos and Cambodia, direct action missions against enemy headquarters, prisoner snatches, psychological operations, everything that couldn't be acknowledged publicly but was essential to the secret war. Thorne, promoted to major, became one of SOG's senior operations officers. His experience with behind-the-lines operations, his knowledge of unconventional warfare, his ability to plan missions that others thought impossible, made him invaluable. He helped establish the standard operating procedures for cross-border operations, trained reconnaissance teams, and participated in mission planning at the highest levels. But Thorne wasn't content to stay in headquarters. At 46 years old, an age when most officers were behind desks, he insisted on accompanying field operations. He wanted to see firsthand how the tactics worked, wanted to make sure the teams were properly supported, wanted to lead from the front the way he always had. On October 15th, 1965, 3 days before his death, Thorne was photographed with a reconnaissance team preparing to launch. The photograph, the last ever taken of him, shows a man who looks older than his years. Weathered face, eyes that have seen too much combat, but standing straight, equipment checked, weapon ready. He's surrounded by Vietnamese helicopter pilots and fellow Green Berets, all of them about to conduct the first official cross-border operation into Laos. Operation Shining Brass was the code name. The mission was to locate Viet Cong turnaround points along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and destroy them with airstrikes. The trail, running through supposedly neutral Laos, was the main supply line for communist forces in South Vietnam. Interdicting it was crucial but politically sensitive. American forces officially weren't supposed to be in Laos. 2 South Vietnamese Air Force CH-34 helicopters launched from Cam Duc Special Forces Camp on the morning of October 18th. The weather was marginal, clouds hanging low over the mountains, visibility poor. But the mission had approval at the highest levels, and weather windows in that region were rare. The decision was made to proceed. The first helicopter, carrying the 6-man reconnaissance team, descended through a gap in the clouds and successfully inserted the team into a landing zone just inside Laos. The team radioed confirmation, "Team OK," and began moving toward their objective. The second helicopter, the command and control bird carrying Major Thorne and the 3-man South Vietnamese crew, remained at altitude, orbiting, maintaining radio contact. For 30 minutes, everything proceeded normally. The reconnaissance team moved toward their observation position. The command helicopter maintained station above them. Weather conditions were poor but manageable. Then the team radioed their initial report. They were in position, had observed trail activity, and were preparing to call in airstrikes. Thorne acknowledged the transmission. His voice, calm and professional, gave instructions to remain in position and continue observation. That was the last transmission anyone heard from the command helicopter. What happened next is subject to speculation. The weather deteriorated rapidly, common in that mountainous region. Visibility dropped to near zero. The helicopter, attempting to return to Cam Duc, either became disoriented in the clouds or encountered severe turbulence, or possibly mechanical failure. The CH-34, a reliable workhorse but not designed for high-altitude operations in severe weather, went down. Search and rescue operations began immediately. Aircraft flew the probable flight path looking for wreckage, for emergency signals, for any sign of the missing helicopter. Ground teams, including SOG personnel who knew Thorne and would risk everything to find him, prepared to deploy. The reconnaissance team, still in their observation position inside Laos, was told to remain in place and watch for any sign of the downed aircraft. For 3 days the search continued. The terrain was unforgiving, steep mountains covered with triple canopy jungle. Visibility from the air was nearly impossible. Ground access was blocked by terrain and by the presence of North Vietnamese forces operating in the area. But SOG didn't abandon their own. The search went on. On October 21st, a ground team found wreckage scattered down a steep mountainside. The CH-34 had hit the mountain at high speed, disintegrating on impact. The 3-man Vietnamese crew was found, all killed instantly. But Major Larry Thorne's body was not at the crash site. Despite extensive searching, despite expanding the search area, despite going over every square meter of terrain multiple times, he had vanished. Theories abounded. Maybe he had been thrown from the aircraft before impact. Maybe he had survived the crash and walked away, injured and disoriented, dying in the jungle. Maybe enemy forces had found him, alive or dead, and removed his body. The uncertainty was agonizing for those who knew him. The US Army officially classified Thorne as killed in action, body not recovered. His name was added to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall, Panel 2E, Line 126. Memorial services were held at Fort Bragg. His personal effects were packed and prepared for shipment to his family in Finland. Officially, Major Larry Allen Thorne was dead. But among those who had served with him, doubt persisted. Men who had watched Thorne survive impossible situations, who knew his survival skills exceeded those of any soldier in the army, refused to believe he was dead. If anyone could survive a helicopter crash in the jungle, it's Larry, they said. He's walked out of worse. For years, every time Special Forces units deployed to Southeast Asia, they carried photos of Thorne in case someone somewhere had seen him. His picture was shown to defectors, to prisoners, to anyone who might have information. Reports circulated of a Caucasian prisoner in North Vietnamese camps, though none were ever verified. Thorne's friends held annual gatherings, toasting his health, maintaining hope that somehow, impossibly, he would return. The Finnish government, which had once imprisoned him, now honoured him as a national hero. The Mannerheim Cross he had earned in the Winter War was displayed in military museums. Books were written about Detachment Törni's exploits. Veterans organisations maintained his memory, refusing to let the world forget what he had accomplished. In the United States he remained largely unknown. A few veterans knew his story, passed it along to new generations of Special Forces soldiers. The headquarters building at Fort Carson, Colorado, home of the 10th Special Forces Group, was named the Larry Thorne Building. But outside of Special Forces, his name meant nothing. Then, in 1999, 34 years after the crash, a joint US-Vietnamese team investigating crash sites in Southeast Asia received information about wreckage on a remote mountain in Quang Nam Province. The coordinates matched the general area where Thorne's helicopter had gone down. A recovery team was assembled. The terrain was as bad as it had been in 1965. The team had to cut steps into the steep mountainside, string ropes for handholds, and work at altitude in oppressive heat. They excavated the crash site, methodically sifting through decades of jungle growth and soil. They found the remains of the CH-34 helicopter, corroded but identifiable. They found a Swedish K-submachine gun, the weapon Thorne had carried, reduced to a barrel and receiver by time and weather. They found personal items, equipment, and most importantly, human remains. The remains were transported to the Central Identification Laboratory in Hawaii, where forensic anthropologists and DNA specialists began the identification process. The Vietnamese crew members were identified through Vietnamese records and dental records. But the fourth set of remains required more analysis. Dental records, preserved in military files for 34 years, were compared to the remains. DNA analysis was conducted, complicated by the age of the remains and the tropical environment's effect on preservation. The process took months, with scientists working carefully to ensure accuracy. In December 1999, the identification was confirmed. The remains were those of Major Larry Allen Thorne, United States Army Special Forces. He had been killed in the helicopter crash on October 18, 1965. He had been on that mountain all along, waiting 34 years to be found. The news was met with mixed emotions by those who had known him. Relief that the mystery was finally solved. Grief that the impossible hope he might still be alive was finally definitively ended. Pride that he would finally receive the burial he deserved. On June 26, 2003, Major Larry Allen Thorne was buried with full military honours in Arlington National Cemetery. The ceremony was attended by Special Forces veterans from multiple generations, Finnish military representatives, members of the Mannerheim Cross Recipients Association, and friends from 3 continents. The funeral procession included a riderless horse, traditional for fallen warriors, with boots reversed in the stirrups. An honour guard from the 3rd Infantry Regiment carried the flag-draped casket. A bugler played taps. A firing party fired 3 volleys. The flag was folded and presented to Finnish representatives, since Thorne had no immediate family. The gravestone, white marble like all the others in Arlington, lists his name, rank and dates of service. But what it cannot capture is the extraordinary life those dates encompass. Born in Finland, fought in 3 armies, died in Vietnam. Each line represents a war, a cause, a lifetime of combat compressed into 46 years. Major Larry Thorne is the only former member of the Waffen-SS buried in Arlington National Cemetery. This fact, potentially controversial, was carefully considered before approval was granted. The decision was based on the totality of his service. His time in the Waffen-SS was as a Finnish officer, fighting under Finnish command against the Soviet invasion of his homeland. His subsequent service to the United States, his valor, his sacrifice outweighed the technical affiliation with German forces. The inscription on his gravestone includes his decorations: the Mannerheim Cross, the Iron Cross, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart with 4 oak leaf clusters, indicating 5 awards. No other grave in Arlington displays such a combination of honours from such disparate nations. The transformation of Larry Thorne's reputation from wanted war criminal to honoured American hero took decades and spanned continents. In 1945, he was hunted by Soviet authorities who wanted him executed for fighting against the Red Army. In 1965, he died leading American forces against communist expansion. In 2003, he was buried with honours reserved for the nation's most revered warriors. The legacy of Larry Thorne within Special Forces is profound. He represents the ideal of the unconventional warrior, someone who fights not for pay or glory but for cause. His causes throughout his life remained constant: resistance to tyranny, defense of freedom, and unrelenting opposition to communist expansion. The tactics he developed in Finland against the Soviets influenced American Special Forces doctrine for decades. Small unit operations, deep penetration raids, living off the land. These weren't new ideas, but Thorne had proven them in combat repeatedly against a determined enemy. His teaching at Fort Bragg passed these lessons to generations of Green Berets who would use them in Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, and conflicts yet to come. The story of Detachment Törni, the Finnish ski troops who terrorized Soviet rear areas, became required study for Special Forces officers. The operations were analyzed, the tactics dissected, the lessons learned and applied. Modern direct action missions, the kind conducted by Special Forces and SEAL teams today, owe much to the concepts Thorne proved in the snows of Finland. But beyond tactics and techniques, Thorne's legacy is about character. He was offered, multiple times, comfortable rear area assignments, teaching positions, staff jobs, opportunities to serve out his time safely and retire with full benefits. He refused them all. At 46, an age when most officers were planning retirement, he was flying command and control missions over Laos. Master Sergeant Barry Sadler, who knew Thorne at Fort Bragg and later wrote the famous song Ballad of the Green Berets, said in a 1980 interview, "Larry didn't know how to quit. He'd been fighting since he was 20 years old, and fighting was what he did. Not because he liked it, though he was good at it, because he believed in it. He believed that communism had to be stopped, and if that meant fighting until he died, then that's what he'd do. And that's what he did." In Finland, Lauri Törni is remembered as one of the greatest soldiers in Finnish history. The Infantry Museum in Mikkeli has an entire exhibit dedicated to him. The Military Museum in Helsinki displays his Mannerheim Cross alongside the crosses of other recipients. Books, documentaries and articles continue to be published about his wartime exploits. The Lauri Törni Tradition Guild, formed by survivors and descendants of Detachment Törni, maintains his memory and that of the men who served with him. They hold annual commemorations, invite international guests, and work to ensure that new generations understand what Törni and his men accomplished against impossible odds. In Germany, his service with the Waffen-SS is a complicated subject. German historians acknowledge his fighting ability, while noting that he served in a Finnish unit, fighting for Finnish national interests, and was never involved in war crimes. The distinction is important in understanding how a Waffen-SS officer could later become an honored member of the US military. In the United States, outside of Special Forces circles, Thorne remains largely unknown. He has never been the subject of a major Hollywood film, though several scripts have been written. He has no major memorial beyond the Fort Carson headquarters building and his gravestone in Arlington. Most Americans, if they've heard of him at all, know him from brief mentions in books about MACV-SOG or Special Forces history. This obscurity is, in some ways, fitting. Thorne didn't seek fame. He sought only to fight the enemy he believed threatened everything he valued. He succeeded in that fight for 25 years, from Finland to Germany to Vietnam, until a helicopter crash in bad weather finally accomplished what Soviet armies, German occupation forces, and Viet Cong insurgents could not. The question often asked is what drove him. Why, after escaping death so many times, did he continue to volunteer for combat? Why not accept a comfortable stateside assignment, teach at Fort Bragg, retire with honour? The answer, according to those who knew him, was simple. It was all he knew how to do. Captain Charles Chuck Perry, who served with Thorne at MACV-SOG, described him in a 2005 interview. Larry had survived so much, fought in so many battles, that I think he couldn't imagine doing anything else. He was 46, but he moved like a man half his age. He was in the jungle, planning operations because that's where he belonged. Asking Larry to stop fighting communists would be like asking a fish to stop swimming. It was his nature. The irony of Thorne's death is that it came not from enemy action but from weather and terrain, the elements that had been his allies for so long. In Finland, winter weather and rugged terrain protected his ski troops from Soviet pursuit. In Germany, mountain terrain allowed his unit to evade larger forces. In Vietnam, jungle and mountains provided cover for SOG operations. But on October 18th, 1965, those same elements killed him. Weather-related helicopter crashes killed more American soldiers in Vietnam than many realize. The CH-34, while reliable, was never designed for the high-altitude, bad-weather operations that Vietnam required. Pilots, under pressure to support ground troops regardless of conditions, pushed the aircraft's limits. Sometimes, the weather won. The reconnaissance team that Thorne had inserted that morning completed their mission successfully. They observed Ho Chi Minh Trail traffic, called in airstrikes that destroyed several trucks and a supply cache, and were extracted 3 days later without casualties. They learned of Thorne's death when they returned to base. Several team members requested to join the search parties, feeling responsible for his loss, though no one blamed them. The mission had been his choice, his decision to fly command and control in bad weather, his acceptance of risk that all SOG personnel understood. Today, at the Special Operations Memorial Foundation in Tampa, Florida, Thorne's name is inscribed alongside other Special Operations personnel killed in action. At the Special Forces Memorial at Fort Liberty, North Carolina, his sacrifice is commemorated. At Arlington National Cemetery, his grave receives visitors from around the world, many of them Finnish veterans or their descendants, coming to honor their national hero who found a final resting place far from home. The legacy continues through new generations. Young officers attending the Special Forces qualification course learn about Thorne's operations in Finland. They study his tactics, understand his mindset, and aspire to his standard of excellence. The phrase "LTD," what would Larry Thorne do, appears occasionally in Special Forces planning sessions, only half joking. In 2010, the US Army Special Forces Command held a ceremony recognizing Thorne's contributions to the regiment. Colonel Sean Swindell in his remarks said, "He was a complex yet driven man who valorously fought oppression under 3 flags and didn't acknowledge the meaning of quit. His service reminds us that Special Forces attracts warriors from many backgrounds, united by common cause. Major Thorne represents the best of what we aspire to be." The story of Larry Thorne is ultimately a story about choosing to fight, not because you have to, not because you'll be punished if you don't, but because you believe in something larger than yourself. Thorne could have stayed in Finland, accepted Soviet domination, lived quietly under communist rule. He chose to resist. He could have stayed in Sweden, lived as a refugee, forgotten the war. He chose to fight. He could have accepted a desk job in the US Army, served out his time safely, retired comfortably. He chose Vietnam. Each choice led him closer to that mountain in Laos, to that helicopter crash, to his death at 46. But each choice was consistent with the man he was, the warrior he had become, the cause he had devoted his life to pursuing. He died fighting communism, the same enemy he'd faced since he was 20 years old, in the same kind of operation he'd conducted for 25 years. If someone had offered him a different death, comfortable, peaceful, years in the future, he probably would have refused it. The mountains of Laos, where Thorne's helicopter crashed, are now accessible to tourists. The exact crash site, high on a steep slope, remains remote and dangerous. A small memorial, erected by Finnish veterans and American Special Forces personnel, marks the location. It's visited occasionally by hikers willing to make the difficult trek, by veterans paying respects, by Finns wanting to honour their hero. The inscription on the memorial is in Finnish and English. It reads simply, Lauri Törni, Captain, Finnish Army, Captain, Waffen-SS, Major, United States Army, fought for 3 nations, died for one cause, freedom. That cause, the fight against totalitarianism, against communist expansion, against tyranny in all its forms, is what connected Thorne's service across 3 armies. The uniforms changed, the languages changed, the terrain changed. But the enemy remained the same, and so did Thorne's determination to fight it. In the end, that's what makes his story so compelling. Not the decorations, though they're impressive, not the operations, though they were extraordinary, but the single-minded devotion to a cause, pursued across decades, across continents, to the very end. On October 18, 1965, when that CH-34 helicopter crashed into a mountain in Laos, killing Major Larry Thorne, the Soviet Union lost an enemy it had been trying to kill for 25 years. The Communist forces in Vietnam lost one of the most effective unconventional warfare experts arrayed against them. The United States Army lost a legend, and Finland lost a hero. But the cause Thorne fought for, the defense of freedom against totalitarian aggression, lived on. It lived on in the Special Forces soldiers he trained, who carried his lessons to future conflicts. It lived on in the tactics he developed, which became doctrine. It lived on in his example, showing that one person, properly motivated, properly trained, properly determined, can make a difference against impossible odds. 3 armies, 3 wars, 3 flags, 1 enemy, 1 cause, 1 warrior. Larry Thorne didn't just fight in those wars, he personified them. He was the embodiment of resistance, the eternal warrior, the man who refused to quit when quitting would have been easier, safer, more rational. And in the end, he got the death he probably wanted if warriors want such things. Not in a hospital bed, not in retirement, not fading away forgotten, but in action, leading from the front, doing what he did best until the very last moment. The Soviet Union, the enemy he fought his entire adult life, collapsed in 1991, 26 years after his death. The communist system that threatened Finland, that occupied Eastern Europe, that spread across Southeast Asia, was defeated. Not by any single person, not by any single battle, but by the accumulated resistance of millions who refused to submit. Thorne was one of those millions, not the most famous, not the most decorated, but perhaps the most relentless. From the snows of Finland to the jungles of Vietnam, he never stopped fighting. And when they finally recovered his body from that mountainside in 1999, found his remains among the wreckage after 34 years, he was still there, still on mission, still serving. They brought him home to Arlington, laid him to rest with honours, and carved his name in marble. But his real memorial isn't in any cemetery, it's in the Special Forces soldiers who learned from his example. In the tactics manuals that carry his innovations, in the stories told around campfires by veterans who knew him or knew of him, in the knowledge that when your cause is just and your determination absolute, one person can fight armies. The eternal warrior had finally come home.